Today, where I'm talking about the future of web technology, how we build web pages, and I'm focusing on web components. Why? We're using that in AUI. So in my role, I'm the dev manager across ADG and AUI. And Atlassian is making a bold move into web components. But this talk's not about how you use web components. If anyone went to Dallas's talk next door a couple of hours ago, that was a very this is how you use web components, code line by line. We're not talking about that today. What I'm talking about is why we use web components, why it's important for AUI, why we went in that direction, and why you might want to too. I also want to talk about how web components is like a different headspace. If you're used to a lot of JavaScript MVC frameworks like Backbone or React or Angular or the plethora that are out there, there's a mental shift in using web components. Now, so, as I said, I am the dev manager on AUI and ADG. As part of my job, it's, working with web components. We made that call. Now, I'm going to assume there's a bunch of people in the audience with varying levels of experience, some front end, some full stack, some not developers, some people who are like, dude, WTF is web components, some people who know what web components are, maybe looked at them, some people who have looked and read up and actually started, spiked using them. So a little bit of an introduction to web components. The main thing that we're talking about is custom elements. So I can define an HTML tag and someone plonks that into the DOM and it, enhances it. It does a bunch of markup. It styles it internally and adds more markup inside. Now, who's using web components? GitHub's using web components a bit. They're like date thing. Pinterest is using them more. And Atlassian is going particularly my team is going headlong into web components. If you open up Bitbucket or Jira or Stash or Confluence, you will find web components on the page in cloud today. Let's kick off with an example, though, to look at how we actually use web components. And fun as live coding is, I know everyone's like, man, whoa, wouldn't it be awesome? I actually videoed myself live coding. So anyway, we're going to see actually using a web component in the browser, using the console. Now, people who know me or have seen me do other talks will be unsurprised to know that I built a meme generator web component. So you basically, you have this meme custom element. It's got different images like, first world problems, one does not simply, my personal favorite, the Doge, why etc. Now, that's the basic of that, but obviously generating a meme, something like that, it's not very funny unless there's some kind of supposedly humorous text accompanying the picture that you've seen 18,000 times before. And when we first started doing web components, people were like, okay, all right, so we want to add stuff to it. Like, what's the JavaScript API for this, for, adding text in this example? And I'm like, JavaScript, come on, man, this is web components, dude. The API is the DOM. So how do you add text? Well, you add meme text here. And what my component does is take meme text elements. In this case, you can add text. You've got a bunch of attributes like position, and you might have some text like why put structure in markup. Why would you not put the actual structure of the document in the DOM? That's what it's for. Next thing, how do I actually interact with this? And the first thing is events, right? So in this case, I've got events. So when you change it, it'll update. Obviously, you could put a kind of URL for the image, so it's going to be asynchronous. It has a start event when it starts generating, has an end event when it finishes, or an error event if the image gets like a 404, something like that. And the events, because these are HTML elements, they're just regular DOM events. So what I have here, I'm just using document add event listener. I've got this meme generate start event. And when it starts generating, it'll log like a wow. And wow, isn't that awesome? I actually have a bit more of a constructed example here. And in this case, what I've done is just brought in a spinning library, and I'm just adding 3 lines of code, which are just using regular DOM events. I'm going to listen to meme generate start, and I'll start spinning, and on end and error, I'll stop spinning. And so this is that code executing when I update the DOM. So here I'm changing it back to why you know. Come on, oh no, start the video, hey. And we get a spinner that disappears when it finishes. The last thing about web components is methods. So when we change stuff, in order to interact with this, if you want methods on your component that are callable from JavaScript, remember the structure goes in the DOM, but you might have some kind of behavior that makes sense in methods. For me, I've just implemented a update method, which just causes the whole image to regenerate itself. And that is on the DOM element. So here, I'm getting the DOM element, so get elements by tag name, meme, the first one, and I'm just calling update, which, as you saw, caused the meme to refresh itself. Now, I'm not going to go into the code for how you work with that. If you want to look at the code, you can. You definitely can't spell my name, but it's on the program, so hopefully that'll help you remember. The next important thing is why? Why is this so important? Why are you doing it? In my job, ADG is what to do and why you do it, right? It's the design guidelines. And OWI is the code for implementing this stuff. Now, if you look at a pattern like an OWI message, right? I'm sure you've seen 1,800 of those in Atlassian products. How do you actually render that? Well, this is the markup, right? You've got a div, it's got a title, it's got some stuff in there. This is the actual content that doesn't change. Everything else is boilerplate. If we look at something like a page header, that's slightly more complex. With an avatar and stuff, it looks like this. That is the stuff that actually changes. Everything else is boilerplate. Onto tabs, even more complex. Whoa, dude, there's a lot of markup for just doing 2 tabs. And I know, I'm kind of the person who's most responsible for this, right? So I can, I share your pain at having written some of this. If we go back to the message for a moment, we said it's complex, right? There's a lot of boilerplate. The things that you can change are hard to know, right? So there's a lot of problems. First is the HTML is kind of complex. It's easy to make a mistake. It's easy to get wrong. And it's hard to tell if you've made a mistake too. There's nothing validating. There's no compiler. It's also unclear what's part of the pattern and what can't be changed. So, for example, is a title compulsory? It's not clear from the API. What about that title? Does that need to be in a strong? Again, it's not clear. Does that P, around this instance, the actual message content, does it need that? A whole bunch of other stuff. It's unclear what you can override by CSS and what you can assume. Do you assume that it's always block level, or could it possibly inline? Well, that's not communicated on the API either. What can you override, right? Jira ran into a big problem in the Jira 6.3 upgrade where we made a change to messages to make the icon high density, so I was using a SVG rather than or an icon font rather than an image. And Jira had overridden a bunch of stuff in ways that we kind of didn't want them to, but it wasn't obvious. You couldn't do that from the API. And it ended up with us having to roll back some changes to get 6.3 out, and then they did that. And then we kind of, fixed up that tech debt and made it work, right? But that's not a good situation for us. Not a good situation for anyone. And the other thing is, in terms of API, it's really not clear what you can depend on in the CSS. I mentioned, is it block level or inline, right? Clearly, the fact that those classes like OWI message and OWI message info exist is API, yeah, sure. But what about the stuff in them? What about the colors? Can you depend on that? What about, layout kind of properties? Can you override them? We've had big discussions about this, in kind of front-end land between my team and products. And the best answer we can come up with is well, really, some of them are API and we might kind of change, and some of them, and it's, we can't really define which is which. So overall, the problem with this is that there's a bunch of implementation and interface mixed up, and there's no clear separation. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes about interface. Now, once the product's task is known, design the interface first, and then implement the interface design. Does anyone know who Jeff Raskin is? He's the guy who basically worked at Apple and basically invented the Mac, right? So he's an industrial designer, and this quote is not talking about API design, it's talking about UI design, or in particular industrial design here. But I think it's such an awesome quote, right? Because, you know, when you look at this in the context of like developer experience and designing APIs, it's clear how many parallels we get between developer experience and user experience. I could talk about that for a whole talk, but let's not go there. Imagine if we designed the interface for our, you know, AUI components, thinking like, what's the best thing for the user? Here's a message. Let's say it's an AUI message. It's got a type, it's got a title, and it's got content. For a page header, it's got a title. You can have an avatar, that's cool. The avatar has a type because, you know, we have different shapes for like project or user avatars. That's all the content that can change. Web components give you this. It's not just new, cool stuff. The core thing about web components is that any programming language gives you the separation between interface and implementation, except for HTML. Now we have that. Imagine if you had like a JavaScript, you know, library or something, and people said, okay, to use this function, you just got to copy and paste this 20 lines of code, and like these are the things you can change. Like, that is just ridiculous, you know? You would never do that, and that's what we've done in HTML up to this point. Web components is the new way for programming in the DOM as if, you know, you had a separation between interface and implementation. So, that's basically the future of AUI's API. It's based on web standards, it's interface driven, and it's backwards compatible. And those are the kind of core principles for us. But, hold on a second. While I have a little sip of water, but hold on too. Oops, sorry. Like, those bottom two, like interface driven and backwards compatible, like haven't those kind of already been solved? I mean, web frameworks I mentioned before, like Backbone or Angular or React or any of the other plethora of JavaScript front-end frameworks is solving these. And so what do you got against them? Well, I don't have anything against them. I think they're awesome. And at Atlassian, we love using them too. So like Jira, like Backbone, and so do Confluence. HipChat, as you saw from Isaac's talk, if you did watch Isaac's talk, HipChat's on React. Stash is on Backbone. Like www.atlassian and like sign up and purchasing is all on Angular. So we have a lot of stuff to support in AUI. We can't just say, oh, you know, like let's use React and then everyone uses React, right? If we got into the situation where, for example, in Jira, they were using Backbone, but they had to bring in React to like have AUI components, well, that'd just be, you know, a big failure of architecture. So web standards are the key thing here. You could solve the bottom two with any framework, but web standards are a key for us in Atlassian. Now, for you, you probably don't have that same problem, right? You're probably not building a UI component library to be delivered to like 6 different products which have their own choice of using a front-end framework. But when you come to a new product, or when you're building your UI for your add-ons or whatnot, or for your customers, you might say, you know what, we're going to build the whole thing in React or Angular or whatnot. And that's a valid choice. However, let's think about that. In the real world, whether you're project-based or whether you're product-based, you know, choosing a framework is something that you kind of do and you know you're going to be there for a few years, right? It's very hard once you've gone with a framework, written a bunch of code to like, you know, like pull it out and move to a new framework. New developments are always going to arrive, right? Like I reckon React is awesome, right? I love React. I love the flux and the way that it's very opinionated about like how data flows through an organization. But you know what? Or an organization, a piece of software. But you know what? I was that excited about Backbone 3 years ago as well. The thing about web components, they're a browser standard. They will always be there in your user's browser. There's no like, you know, as it's a web standard, it's like the incentive to like keep re-implementing that same stuff is different too. So what we do find in the web, particularly over the last 5 years, is, I keep mentioning, like, there's a bunch of frameworks, right? Backbone, React, Angular, probably the most, notable or most widely used, but there are like a bunch of others. Ember, all kinds of things. If you go to like, to do MVC, there's like 50 different frameworks with to do MVC implementations. Now, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here and sort of talk about the future, and often when conference speakers kind of make predictions about the future, it's like, probably think they're full of shit. But, listen to my logic and you can work out whether you disagree or not. When you start from nothing, right, it's easy to keep reinventing different ways to do things. And all these frameworks are basically reinventing different ways to build applications, where you have views, which is about rendering. You have models, which is your server-side models. In between, you often have view models, which is like, the components, like objects which represent the kind of stuff that's on screen. And also marshalling for, like you've got lots of views, lots of view models, propagating changes and organizing like a large application. And when you have none of that in the browser, it makes sense, it's easy to kind of keep reinventing it. When you have something, the incentive to like keep reinventing it for new ways is much lower. And the bar for like, well, we need a new way of doing this is much higher, right? So if you've got web components in your browser, there's no sense to keep rebuilding different ways of doing views and view models, which are what the web components give you. Views are like the rendering inside the component, and your view model is the markup in the DOM. So I really think, and this is subjective, you can agree or disagree, but like, web components are going to become very fundamental to the way that we build UIs in the next few years. And I mean that in the sense of like, if you look at the landscape of version control, it's dominated by DVCS and in particular Git, to a lesser extent Mercurial. Web components will dominate the way we build UIs in the same way. We'll see hybrid approaches where web components at the leaves, like doing the rendering and view models and putting stuff into the actual screen. And then other frameworks will exist, kind of like Flux, the relationship between Flux and React, where Flux is about coordinating large bunches of models and organizing like a big hierarchy of a page, or like a complex single page application. All right, so I've done like, a bit of a sales pitch on web components, talked about the future. I gave this talk at a user group in Sydney, and, asked for questions afterwards, and the best question came first. It was like, okay, so you've told us about all this good stuff, what sucks about it? Clearly we've used it in production, we've run into some issues and, we've solved them, so I think if you want to use that, it makes sense for us to talk about the roads that we, the bumps in the road that we hit. The first thing is polyfilling. So web components haven't landed in all browsers yet. They are in Chrome. And we use Skate.js internally for web components. It's an open source library. It was written by a guy on my team called Trey Sugar. He's like one of the best devs I've ever worked with. He's awesome. It uses native web components where they're available in Chrome under the hood. Jira and Service Desk also use Skate independently of AUI, and that's one of, I think, the big benefits of that compared to Polymer, which is the other web component polyfill from Google. Because of our use case at Atlassian, Jira's using Skate, AUI's using Skate, Service Desk is using Skate, and they're all like differently versioned and they've all got their own thing. So Skate's designed to support multiple versions of a skate on a page and not kind of, bump into each other or cross over. That's an explicit use case that it supports. In addition, compared to Polymer, like Polymer's just gone to 1.0 and it dropped a lot of like weight. I think they're different use cases too. So Polymer's like there to use web components now, but also to explore the kind of spec and see what's possible and doesn't make sense. Skate is like, dude, we want to use this now in Atlassian. What's the minimum we need to do it? And there's also some things, so you might have heard about the shadow DOM in web components. Dallas talked about it in his talk. We won't ever use the shadow DOM polyfill because it's kind of too expensive, so Skate doesn't have it, where Polymer would because it's got that use case of exploring the spec too. Skate works in all our supported browsers. That's all I have to say about Skate. So the next thing is performance. So one of the first kind of things that happened with web components was we landed it in AUI, we got it into Stash and Bitbucket. Now Stash and Bitbucket have code review, and in their code review pages, dude, for their CI, for their testing, they run with incredibly large DOMs. You can imagine a big pull request, right? Like thousands of DOM nodes. And it caused a performance regression first up. And we solved that by basically being able to mark a section of the DOM as like, hey, Skate, don't go inside here. And so it wouldn't traverse like the big kind of pull request section with thousands of nodes. And you know, that's not like an ideal solution. It's a little bit kludgy, but on the other hand, if you are using it, you do know that that problem has been encountered and solved, and it's a real world problem we have a workaround. The last thing, we're answering questions about this. So, there are still some things in the web component spec which are a little, well, questions still to be solved. So for example, this is how we do a drop-down in AUI. It's one of our new components, it's a drop-down. That's how it works. You've got an AUI select, it's got an ID. Now, clearly, if I'm doing this in a real-world situation, I care about accessibility. I know all of you do, obviously, as well. And you'll have a label. This AUI select is going to generate a text box inside, which is what I type in. Now, my label, the for attribute has to be the ID of that text box. It's not the ID of the AUI select, right? It's the ID of the text box. When you click on it, it'll focus. When you, or when you click in it, the screen reader will announce that it's a label. And so we had to develop a solution for making that work, right? Because this ID is, the ID that we put on the actual text box is auto-generated. And the way we did that is by basically saying, you know, we've got an AUI label, that'll generate an actual label element which the same rules, which knows about the rules that AUI select does. So we've solved that problem too. So, to finish up, web components. We're using them, and they're ready to use. They solve a bunch of problems for us, and I believe they'll solve a bunch of problems for you. And the third thing, you will end up using them. Even if you don't know it yet, you're going to. So, thank you very much. Hope you found this entertaining and enlightening. I'm not going to answer questions now, but come up and ask me later if you have any questions. Thank you.